Crystal Maiden here, and today we're going to be tackling the black sheep of the Zelda franchise, Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. And I'm playing it on the Wii Virtual Console because I don't have an NES, and the version of it I grew up with was the Game Boy Advance one, but I don't have a Game Boy player, so I'm gonna have to show this one off instead. But basically, the reason this game is so infamous is because it's not like all of the other Zelda games, and it's a side-scroller platformer. It's still a dungeon crawler, of course, but it's all about, well, there isn't really that much platforming. I mean, the biggest platforming challenges really are just carefully landing your jumps on platforms so that you don't fall in the lava. It's not really about platforming, it's more about a side-scroller. It's more focused on the combat, just like Zelda 1. It's more about killing the enemies than platforming. And killing the enemies is testing out a completely different skill from every other Zelda game. It's all about timing your hits and carefully observing the enemy. And I love how Link has more than one type of attack in this game. The first technique he has is the regular stab, but he also has a crouch stab. And the cool thing is that you can actually do the crouch stab in midair. And you're gonna find that to be extremely useful. Like, I think a lot of the reason people think this game is so hard is because they don't know that you can do a crouch stab in midair. But doing that makes some of the enemies a lot easier to deal with, because you can just jump at them and do crouch stabs over and over again. Because if you restrict yourself to just those two attacks, then you can only hit from two specific heights. But the mid-air crouch stab lets you hit from the middle height, you know? These bats are called aches instead of keys for some reason. And the bean enemies are called bits and bots. The bits are the light blue ones, and the bots are the dark blue ones that you'll find in temple. So there are some specific areas in the overworld that you walk into them and they transport you to platforming sections, like battle areas like this. And you don't want to go into the dark caves because you can't. It's not like Zelda 1 where you can basically navigate around a dark cave without the candle. In this game, I've gone through some dark caves without the candle before. Like, I once went through the second cave without a candle. And mainly because, well, there's no pits. And I memorized the game, so I know exactly what to do in it. Like, I played this game a lot as a kid. So I'm pretty soft on it, I gotta say. I mean, I have a lot of nostalgia for it, and I think this is a good game until you get to the Island Palace. That's where the game starts. That's where the game's worst problem starts to come into play. But for the most part, I think this is a good enough game that I enjoy it enough that I can sit down and play it all the way up to at least the Island Palace and not want to stop. Even though I die a bunch of times, because the game is pretty hard. Oh, sprite flickering. I don't actually remember that ever happening in the Game Boy Advance port of this. There isn't really that many differences between the Game Boy Advance port and the NES port. Yeah, this is the first Zelda game to introduce the concept of villages. In Zelda 1, all of the NPCs were just scattered around, hiding in caves like it was the caveman days for some reason. And this game proves that the NES is capable of having villages with NPCs for Zelda games, because now I just love how there's all sorts of villages, and they all have their own unique feel to them. Something that's distinctive to Zelda 2 is that you can get spells from town wizards. I kind of wish they brought this back. It's pretty cool. The spells are basically the replacement for items. I mean, you get items in dungeons, but they're usually something that has an effect on the overworld, or Candle, where they light up the dark rooms. The spells allow you to do some pretty interesting things, and I'll be going over that later. The overworld has three different types of sprites that can actually bother you. Oh, that enemy I just attacked is called a Louder. It slithers along the floor, and you can actually see it on the floor in dark caves. So if you pay attention to the floor enough, you can see it coming and attack it. I hate these rising bubbles. You have to be careful about your platforming here, so that they won't rise up to you when you're trying to jump from platform to platform. But anyways, the big enemies on the overworld, they're strong random encounters, which means you're going to fight stronger enemies than normal. Stonehenge in Hyrule? Well, okay. I like this, it's a cool aesthetic. These are Gorias, and they look completely different from the ones in Zelda 1. I think these look better, actually. And they're really annoying because sometimes they feel like a cheap challenge because it's completely impossible to predict. It's kind of unpredictable how exactly they're going to throw their boomerang. And sometimes they can throw their boomerang a lot higher or a lot lower than normal. And of course boomerangs always come back. So then that boomerang will be coming back at you and it'll hit you. And it's a lot harder to dodge all the boomerangs than it looks. It's not like you can always block every boomerang with your shield. But anyways, there's strong enemies and there's weak enemies. And then there's fairies, which appear on the screen, and you walk into them, and it takes you to one screen that you can just get a fairy from. But I think those are rare. In the Japanese version of the game, there's a lot of cosmetic changes between the Japanese version and the international versions. And one of them is that the enemies in the overworld, they look like balloons with eyes. Like, the blue ones are the stronger enemies, and the weak enemies are off-white, and the fairies are completely red. I hate these enemies. Like, look, they don't give you any experience at all. And it's good that they die in one hit, but they constantly, infinitely respawn. The bubbles are pretty annoying, because killing them gives you 50 experience points. Well, in the Japanese version, you're given only 10 experience points, which as you can see is a complete rip-off considering how many hits it takes to attack this, to kill this. I mean, I tried to count how many hits it takes to defeat a bubble at the beginning of the game. It takes over 71 hits. I lost count. I lost count because Link attacks so many times in a second. It's really hard to keep track of how many times he attacks. But the weird thing about these bubbles is that they don't necessarily bounce off actual walls. They bounce off the borders of the screen. So if that bubble moves to the right, then it's gonna bounce back at me when it hits the edge of the screen, not when it hits the wall to the right of me. It's so annoying attacking this bubble because look, these red things are constantly spawning and they don't leave you alone. Some enemies you kill them and they're gone forever. But other enemies, they'll infinitely respawn, like the bits and bots, for example. Those are called Stalfos, and since it's a platformer, they're fought completely differently, because basically they have shields up, and you have to use a crouch stab to hurt them. Later on you'll find a really annoying Stalfos that will always jump around, and it looks like you can it looks like you can use the upward thrust, which is obtained later in the game, and you can hit them when they jump over you. But actually that's not the case, because even if they do get hit, they're still gonna fall down on you and hurt you. So like, I don't see how that's fair. Like, they're flashing from being hit, but you still get hurt if you're in their hitbox anyways. How is that good design? These are disintegrating bridges, and they look intimidating, but they're not really that big of a deal. I mean, it's really tense trying to get that experience point big. But yeah, if you get it fast enough, you aren't going to fall into lava. Oh, that's another thing about this game. Not only is it a platformer, but it's also an action RPG. So, what I mean by that is, you attack the enemies without being in a menu like it's Final Fantasy. It's not a turn-based RPG. You fight the enemies right here. And I'll hold off on that because I'm fighting two really annoying enemies right now. The red enemy is really annoying. You have to wait until he jumps. Oh, I hate it when that happens. It's so annoying how the red enemy jumps, right? And he's constantly throwing these projectiles. And it's best to wait until he jumps, because then there will be a bigger gap between the projectiles that you can squeeze through without getting hit. It takes forever to grind for... It takes forever to beat those bubbles, by the way. And they're one of the enemies that respawn when you leave the room. Those are called red potions, and they're not really that useful at this point in the game. And you just found a fairy in the dungeon, but this is a hard game for a reason, folks. It's not very common at all to find fairies in dungeons. But anyways, the dark nuts... Oh, here's another example. These things can be kind of annoying. The best way to deal with them is to do what I just did. Constantly jump at them and crouch stab. That way, you're a lot more likely to hit them. Because you're expected to attack them. You're expected to do a crouch stab if they have their shield up, and not do a crouch stab if their shield isn't up. But they move their shield so fast that it doesn't feel like a fair challenge. And even then, even when you're jumping and crouch stabbing at them, you've got to time it exactly right, or you won't hit them. And they can be pretty annoying, but at the same time, I think they're the enemy that I have the most fun fighting. You have to stab keys to collect them for some reason. In Zelda 1, you could just walk into them, but apparently that made too much sense. Well, no, it actually makes even less sense, so you have to stab keys to collect them. It's like, why is that happening? The shield spell basically halves the amount of damage that you are dealt. Which is ironic because it's red, and in Zelda 1, it was the blue mail that halved the amount of damage you took. But in this one, even though it's clearly the red mail you got, you aren't dealt half. You're dealt half as much damage instead of a quarter as much damage. The shield spell comes in handy in some boss fights, but I don't use it all that often. Something unique about Zelda 2 that makes it different from all the other Zelda games is the experience point system, which I kind of like, to be honest. I mean, I spent a lot of time as a kid. I would basically start out a game and I would grind for hours so that I would have a ridiculously large amount of really large amount of levels, and then I could just make my way all the way through Death Mountain without ever beating the first dungeon. I would just get the candle, and that was it. I didn't beat the boss because, oh, Castlevania! Ugh! Yeah, that's gonna happen a lot in this game. A lot of times an enemy is gonna knock you into a pit and there'll be nothing you can do about it. If you're wondering why I didn't fight the boss, it's because beating the boss gets you an automatic level up, no matter how much experience points you have. And it's the rare candy syndrome, you know? Because the last thing you want to do is waste an automatic level up. Because, as you can see, the requirements for leveling up increases the more you beat, the more levels you gain. That was a vital side quest item, by the way. I'll explain more in later parts.